All right. We're still seeing new people come in, but we will start now. So a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar towards carbon neutrality, measuring scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. My name is Toby and I'll guide you through today's webinar. We have a lot of very interesting content and I'm really excited to share this with you. Now, there's one big question that will guide today's webinar, and this big question is, how can I move my company towards carbon neutrality? Now, carbon neutrality, that is kind of a bit of a black box for many people because it is kind of a new concept. It's a very new measure of performance. We're all familiar with the measure of performance in finance. We're all familiar with controlling, with our finance reporting, but yeah, carbon neutrality and also the reporting of carbon emissions is still a very foreign concept to many businesses. And today we want to shed a bit of light on this very foreign concept and just help you to get started and understand how can I actually get started on my journey towards carbon neutrality. Now, what can you expect from today's webinar? We will have really great speakers that I'm really happy to have here today. We will have Roel de Grost, who I'll introduce later, who will set the scene and just get you familiar with all the terms that we're talking about, with carbon transparency, what is the GHG protocol, what is the science-based target initiative, and he will get you familiar with the strategies and bigger frameworks behind what we're talking about today, that you get a head start of what's actually happening in the industry and what do you have to know. And then we want to make it very practical. We will have 2 great presentations about case studies that actually did and implemented these strategies. So we'll have Peter Lindetzer, who's going to introduce a case study with the University of Amsterdam. He's going to show us how they measured and implemented environmental reporting at the University of Amsterdam. And Lisa Overmars is going to present the same for an asphalt business. So she's going to show how an asphalt business measured the environmental footprint, as well as how this implementation looked like. So we're going to go from strategy towards implementation, towards an actual case of how this looks in practice. And hopefully at the end of today, you will actually see how you can move your company towards carbon neutrality yourself. Introducing today's speakers. Our main speaker today is Roel de Grost. He's Chief Value Officer here at Ecochain, responsible for our team of environmental specialists. And he will introduce you to the strategy behind global greenhouse gas emissions. Peter Lindetzer is an environmental specialist here at Ecochain, as well as Lisa Overmars. They are helping our clients to measure and improve their environmental footprint. My name is Tobias. I'm the marketing lead here at Ecochain, and I will guide you through today's webinar. But actually, who is actually Ecochain? So our mission is to empower environmental change, and we do that by giving transparency about environmental footprints with our environmental intelligence platform. We've calculated more than 300,000 footprints with clients around the world, based here in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, but we have clients all over the world. I've worked with many businesses in many different industries. And just to give you a bit of an idea of what Ecochain actually does, I have selected 3 client projects that we've done in the past. And it kind of fits in well with today's topic because one of our prime projects that's always kind of a highlight is when we worked on the environmental profit and loss reporting with Philips. Hope everyone knows the company Philips. They did the environmental profit and loss, and we helped them to actually do that, facilitate that. And Roel, actually, our speaker, was a very big part of this project, led this project. Another big client of ours is a company called BAM here in the Netherlands, a big infrastructure construction company. And for them, for example, we helped them to win public tendering based on the Dutch MKI system, which is a measurement system for environmental performance that Lisa is going to introduce also to us later. And then another practical project is with a company called Mud Jeans. That's just a very nice practical example because that's just, okay, they have a jeans product and we help them calculate the product footprints of their jeans. So very practical example. If you want to learn more about our client cases, ecochain.com/story. But that's enough about us. Let's get started with our first speaker, Roel de Grost. And Roel, are you ready?
Always ready, Toby, and
Absolutely.
Thanks for the introduction.
Great, so let's get started.
I see more than 200 people joining this call. A warm welcome to you all. It's a real pleasure to discuss this exciting topic with you today. allow me to first set the scene with you, because a lot is happening in this business. And this is just a couple of pictures to show you what's going on. But what we see in today's world is that companies do a lot on climate. Many big corporates are becoming more purpose-driven companies. They set ambitious targets in their climate strategies. If you cannot open an annual report today without seeing a disclosure on their carbon emissions, in which they just discuss their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Or the Sustainable Development Goals. Also in terms of standards, a lot is going on. But today we will really focus on this greenhouse gas protocol and the science-based targets. So Zazela, next slide please. Yeah, thanks. But why should you bother? Well, first of all, we have a global task, but that's not just, it's not all about taking responsibility. It's also about getting opportunities for your business. Because what we see with some of our clients is that their green products, their low emission products, they're just more profitable and they grow faster in the market. There's higher demand for those kind of products. So it just makes perfect business sense to adopt these kind of strategies. Now, and when you look at access to capital, I have a nice example of Larry Fink. I don't know if you all know who Larry Fink is, but Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock. BlackRock is the biggest asset manager in the world with, I think nowadays, almost $8 trillion assets under management. And they really adopt climate strategy in their investment policy. So if they invest in a business, that business needs to be prepared for climate change. So it really becomes a decisive criterion to get access to capital. Yeah. Now, what we have seen with our clients is that there is a commonality in how they approach carbon neutrality and the journey they take. And we basically see companies taking 5 typical steps. And the first step is always to understand the baseline situation. What are my emissions today? Where are the environmental hotspots? And then the second step is typically about reduction scenarios. How can I improve? What steps can I take? What strategies can I follow to really make a change? And of course, those reduction strategies should focus on the biggest emissions. And then the third step is, what targets are feasible? What should I set as a target? Should I go beyond the Paris Agreement? Should I be more ambitious? Or should I do something else? And then it's all about executing and monitoring. And then the 5th step is a step that not all of our clients take, but it's offsetting the remainder of the carbon emissions. Now, I want to be clear about the scope for today. That is not part of the scope of today. We really want to focus on the first 4 steps out of this 5-step journey. Now, let us set a little bit more the scene regarding the greenhouse gas protocol. This is a timeline. Greenhouse gas reporting is not new. The initial demand started in the previous century already. And then there was, in 2000, the first version of the greenhouse gas protocol became available. There was some initial market adoption. Then some companies like Unilever started to make more ambitious plans. Then we saw, more mandatory disclosure guidelines pop up. I think some of you may know the Grenelle 2 Act within France, which forces companies to report on their environmental performance. The SBTI, which is short for the Science-Based Target Initiative, was founded in, I think it was 2015. And then nowadays we see there is a huge uptake in greenhouse gas reporting. Later on in the presentation, I will show you the exponential growth of companies setting a science-based target for their carbon emissions. But the companies that use the greenhouse gas protocol for reporting, the number is growing rapidly. Now, what is the greenhouse gas protocol? It is a protocol to understand, to really measure your emissions. And for those people who are not familiar with it, the basics of the concept is shown on this page. What the protocol does, it shows you different scopes. It allows you to measure different scopes. And let me briefly explain that. Scope 1 is all about your direct emissions. For instance, by the incineration of fuel. Then Scope 2 is all about indirect emissions related to electricity, steam, and heating. So it's the energy that you procure, but then a third party is having the emissions. And then there is this huge bucket of Scope 3 emissions, which we call indirect emissions. And those are the upstream Scope 3 emissions, as well as the downstream Scope 3 emissions. So those are the emissions that occur in your value chain. And one of the dominant categories in this is, for instance, purchased goods and services. That is then reflecting all the emissions that occur with your suppliers. Now, why is that so important to also report on these Scope 3 emissions? Because you can influence them. For instance, if you're a textile company, you can decide to go to a recycled fabric or a recycled fiber to produce your textiles. Or if you're an electricity or an electronics company, you could decide to make your electronics more energy efficient. So that's why it's so important to also include those Scope 3 emissions. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. Now here are a couple of examples, and these are not industry averages, but they're just examples of some companies that we measured. With at the left-hand side, the upstream Scope 3. The Scope 1 and 2 is shown under own operations, and then Scope 3 downstream at the right-hand side of the slide. And here you see that for many companies, many emissions are occurring in the value chain. And that is why it's so important for many companies to really understand those Scope 3 emissions. It is perfectly justified to start with your own operations, your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and in fact many companies do that. But ultimately, you do want to know your Scope 3 upstream as well as downstream emissions because you can influence them. Next slide, please. Yeah. So a little bit more about the greenhouse gas protocol. And what I showed you here on this page is the most important elements. It's not all elements, but these are key elements for businesses to have a look at. First of all, there's the corporate standard. That's the overarching and encompassing standard, which shows you the why, what, and how of greenhouse gas reporting. It will typically show you how to handle the scope and boundaries of your reporting and how, for instance, how you handle reporting over joint ventures and tracking over time, or how will you handle assurance. Then there is the Scope 2 guidance. So remember, Scope 2 is all about electricity and heat that you procure. And that an important element in there is the market versus the location-based approach. I will get back to that in a minute. And then a big part of the guidance is around Scope 3. Remember, Scope 3 is everything in the value chain, both upstream and downstream. This Scope 3 guidance will provide you with a lot of useful details on how to do that. Next slide, please. So the Scope 2 market-based versus location-based approach. What this will help you do is how to go about. And what the market-based approach is, it is providing you with guidance on how to be really specific on your Scope 2 emissions. So mainly related to electricity that you procure. And this is, for instance, relevant if you have a high Scope 2, but also if you have insight in the electricity mix that you procure. If that's not at all relevant to you, you would typically use the location-based approach, which is much less effort. to do. And then you would use an average electricity grid emission factor, and then you just need to know the number of kilowatt hours that you procure, and you will have your emissions. Next slide, please. So the Scope 3 guidance, well, as you have seen, there are many Scope 3 subcategories: purchased goods and services, the use and end of life phase of your products, everything that is happening in your value chain. What the Scope 3 guidance does, it will provide you with detailed guidance on how to measure all these individual subcategories. And on this slide, I just show you an example of purchased goods and services. And what the protocol does very well, it provides you with decision support on which methodology to use. So, for instance, if purchased goods and services, you see in this decision tree, is that a really relevant impact category for your organization, or is it not? And then you would go typically to a specific approach which suits your business. So, for instance, if it's not very relevant, it doesn't, if it's not very material in your emission bucket, then you would typically go less granular. If it's really important, if you have detailed data available on a typical emission category, you would typically go very granular. Next slide, please. So that was the greenhouse gas protocol. The second part of this intro, we'll spend a couple of minutes on the SBTI, which is short for Science Based Target Initiative. And some people may not know this. Science-based targets are targets to help companies understand whether they operate within the boundaries of the planet. I think most of you are aware of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The IPCC has prepared a couple of scenarios, a 1.5 degree climate change scenario or a 2 degree climate change scenario. And the IPCC has predictions available. Those predictions are also translated to sectors, and science-based targets will typically help you set a target to help your company operate within the 2 degree climate change scenario or the 1.5 degree climate change scenario. So it will also help you, for instance, if you're a CFO or a CEO, to make this claim to the market. I operate within the boundaries of the planet. Next slide, please. Now, if you look to the number of companies that have committed or already set a target, here on this slide you see the trend from the past 5 years. And what you see is that there is a huge uptake of companies who are committing to these targets or have set targets. And this growth is even even accelerating today. It's going faster and faster with more and more companies committing targets. Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I think my presentation is almost ending because time is almost up for me. I just want to provide a couple of things to remember for the audience. We don't have time to go in all detail, but just a couple of things to remember. The first thing, if we start at the left-hand side of this slide, there is specific guidance available for each sector. For many sectors, some sectors are still in preparation. But for instance, if you look to the power sector, that is being finalized. And the power sector is a nice sector to start with because it has a pretty simple output, like kilowatt hours, and it's reasonably easy to benchmark. So to set a science-based target, you can really use the sector metrics to set your SBTs. The other resource you would find on the SBTI website is the target setting tool. I show you a picture in the middle. I really advise you to have a look because it's very easy and it will really help to understand the concept. And then there are a couple of things to remember. SBTI is having a very simple and transparent process to with very tangible steps to go through. You first, as a company, you first commit to setting a target, then you develop this target, you submit the target, the SBTI will review the target to see if it was prepared in accordance with the criteria set by SBTI, and then you can communicate and disclose your targets. SBTI also has a couple of approaches available to on how to set the target, whether you use a 2-degree or a 1.5-degree scenario. It has some requirements with with the term of the targets that you set, so a minimum of 5 years, a maximum of 15 years, etc., etc. I think this concludes my contribution. Toby, back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Roel, for your time. Yeah, it's I always find it super inspiring to see how many companies are picking this up and how many new initiatives are there, but also how much traction these initiatives get. It's just seeing the slide that so many companies now commit to the climate goals is I find very encouraging, especially in times like these. Yeah, audience questions. We did compare a couple of questions that came that were sent in before, specifically for you, Roel. Very general question that always pops up, of course. Will there be a recording? Yes, we will provide every one of you that signed up through the Eventbrite event with a follow-up. So you will get the slides as well as follow-up documents with kind of a summary of everything, as well as a recording of this session. So no worries if you miss anything, if you can't remember something, we provide you with the follow-up. But now let's actually come to some real questions. Roel, this is something I found really interesting. So we have a lot of environmental specialists, sustainability managers, quality health, sustainability, safety management managers in this webinar today. But who actually should own this process in the company? So if a company says, okay, I want to get started with this process today, who actually in the company is responsible for it?
Yeah, good question. Many people will ask themselves, how can I start? And it's also a complex and challenging task because one of the things you need to map your emissions, you would need quite some data from various sources. And actually, to reduce your emissions, you would need buy-in and support from many different functions and stakeholders within the company. If you want, for instance, to change your design of your product, you need to work with the R&D folks. If you need to get something done with your suppliers, you need to work with procurement. If you want to reduce your own energy, you need to work with the energy manager. So my general advice is always to get buy-in with your board at the highest level, that you get support from the highest level. If they will commit and they have the right tone at the top, you will get something done. And then mobilize a multifunctional team across businesses with the stakeholders that are really important to really make things happen. First of all, to obtain data, but then to really make a change with this team.
So get your board on board and have everyone participate. I think that is a good summary. You also just mentioned it's a very complex process. So one other question that came in from France, if I see it correctly, was, so how big does my sample actually need to be for me to start? Do I have to measure everything, or can I also get started on a smaller scope?
No, that's a good question. How to get started? You can make it like a PhD type of research, or you can start pragmatic. I advise to start to do the latter. To start small and to start roughly. For instance, take the category purchased goods and services. So that's the impact of the greenhouse gassing emissions in your supply chain. Well, there are all kinds of databases available for various materials and processes, databases like EcoInvent. I would advise to really start with a simple model, look at where your hotspots are, and then refine the most dominant hotspots rather than spending ages on inventories and emission categories that do not contribute significantly. Keep it simple. That's the
Keep,
message.
keep it simple. Very much like that. Thank you, Roel. We have more questions for later, but now let's move on. Also, if you have any questions that pop up during during the presentations, put them in the chat, please. We will go through the questions later and then answer as many questions as possible in our Q&A at the end of the webinar. What's our first case study? So many of you work in companies or work with companies that are manufacturing companies who produce certain goods. And it's always very interesting to look at products and the footprint of your products. And it looks more simple. You have a clear product, you have materials that go into the product, you have manufacturing process, you have a supply chain. But many of us also work in consulting businesses or maybe software businesses or businesses that don't have a clear, tangible product. So services businesses essentially. And this looks much more complex. How do you measure the impact of a services business? So our first case study will actually work with that, because we actually analyzed the environmental impact of the university and the Hogeschool van Amsterdam. And I'm really glad that we have Peter here today, who will actually walk us through this project and kind of show you what Roel just presented in a very practical manner. And Peter, stage is yours.
Yes, thanks. Hey, yeah, so this is me, Peter Leenertse. I am an environmental specialist at Ecochain for over 4 years now, and I've been working in quite a lot of footprinting projects, also with regard to the greenhouse gas protocol in various industries, from textiles to electronics to agriculture, but also services industries. And that is one case I'll present today. Yes, next slide, please. Yeah, so the next few slides are really meant to take it from the theory that was presented by Roel and really into practice. And there is also going to be some numbers and to give some tangible feeling of what you can do. But maybe the first question that pops up, like, what is the footprint of a university anyway? And that was at least my thought when I started with this project. And it's maybe good to mention, so it's basically a joint entity. It's the University of Amsterdam and the University of Applied Sciences, Hogeschool in Dutch. So it's a joint combination, and I'll show the results and the outcomes and the methodology we'll show before also separately for these entities. But what does it actually look like? So to refer back to the greenhouse gas protocol, so if we think about these scopes, you can think of an educational entity as they have a lot of buildings, they need to heat that, they have refrigerants that they use for cooling of their foods, but also for educational purposes. They purchase electricity in the scope 2. But especially where the emphasis will be on during this presentation is also the scope 3. Most notorious and difficult one, of course. And we will emphasize certain aspects of it, but not everything in detail, but there will be specific focus on the waste and the treatment of the waste, the food for catering and banqueting, commuting of the students and employees, business travel, of course, and also ICT services. So that varies from the purchasing of laptops, mobile phones, and desktops, but also the use of the electricity used for instance, what is really relevant nowadays, streaming of video meetings and the data centers that have to be running for that.
Very nice. Did you actually consider the business travel before pre-COVID or after COVID?
This is all pre-COVID, so yeah, that is indeed a nice addition. So maybe we can talk about that later as well.
Nice, very curious yet.
Yeah, so this is the baseline. So step 1. So the colors indicate in which category it falls. So scope 1 and scope 2 are actually in the case. So the left-hand graph is the university, and the right-hand graph is the Applied Sciences University, but you can actually see they have a slightly different profile. So with the little icons, we've indicated the prime hotspots per entity. So you can see that for the University of Amsterdam, some well, I think it's around 20% of the emissions come from heating and electricity purchasing, so scope 1 and 2. And quite some significant impact comes from purchasing of goods and other services. And for this analysis, we did actually quite thorough study, looking at 50 categories ranging from software purchasing to furniture to books and audio material, stuff like that. So quite broad. So the spend category, to answer the question in the chat, so that is purchased goods and services. And of course, a very big one in this case, as a service organization, and this will be quite different for other, for really producing companies, production kind of companies, is the footprint of travel. The really big green bar is the emissions of students commuting back and forth to have, yeah, of course, pre-COVID. So to go to lectures and do whatever you do on the university, of course. Next slide, please. So the second step is, after you've established this baseline, is to look at the reduction strategies. So in this case, we work together with a sustainability manager from the UvA and the HVA, so the two entities, and they already had a plan in place, or reduction strategies, and those are listed on the bottom of the graph from 1 to 8. So 8 potential things they could implement to reduce the overall impact of their operations. So how you can read this graph is basically that, think of the previous graph where we established the baseline. This is 0%, so that would be the baseline. And all these individual measures, they show what the potential is of executing it. So step 1 would be to purchase a renewable power agreement. That was already performed by them, I think, in 2018, and that has already reduced their footprint by 28% of the total. Yeah, so that is actually a pretty big step and a pretty easy step you can take as a company, of course. And in this case, it had quite a significant effect. Another step that they had or a strategy that they have in the pipeline is to look at their procurement operations or the procurement process. So for their ICT purchasing process, they are looking at, they are looking at potential things they can do to reduce the footprint. So one of these options would be to purchase 20% of their new devices as refurbished instead of actually new ones. And another measure would be, instead of, I think it was 3 years per device per person that you get as an employee, your laptop and your mobile phone, extend it by 9 months and see what the effect would be. So these two measures combined actually amount to 0.5% of the total footprint. So that is not too effective. Another one that is actually pretty big is measure 4, and that means this is part of a grander strategy, and it's called the Paris Proof All Electric scenario, and that means basically phasing out gas as your heat source for all the buildings that they have and they own, and also maximize the amount of renewable energy that you generate on site. And this measure, or this strategy, actually has a quite a large effect. So around 12.5% of your footprint could be reduced by executing this. Then we have the catering and banqueting department, something that is really visible, of course, on the by the employees, but also visiting lecturers or other parties that can visit the university. But what we saw, although it's being really pushed really hard by the management and also employees that focus on this, one of the measures is removing the bottled water from the vending machines, is that it has very little effect on the overall footprint. The same goes for a vegan banqueting, so for conferences and stuff like that, have a vegan meal, and removing beef from the menu and replacing that by pork and chicken, not going all vegan or all vegetarian, has 0.1% effect on the total. That is what this actually shows. And then to the bigger one, and that goes into the mobility part, and that has actually become really interesting because before we started this journey together with them, they actually said like mobility is something we cannot change. People have to come to the building to have a lecture, and this is actually something we don't really want to look at, but we did anyway. And this is actually the potential of reducing the amount of contact hours by 1 day a week. So that means if you work from home 1 day a week, you can reduce the footprint of the overall university by, what is it, around 8.5%, and that's only for 1 day a week. So that's actually a really effective measure, and times have changed, and now it seems to be possible. All right, next slide,
Very
please.
interesting. Yeah, I also just saw in the chat there was a question of actually some people mentioned that turning off video during a video chat reduces the impact of a video call. So thank you for that input. Now it would be interesting to also compare that to how these impacts will compare, turning video impacts versus the reduced commute of students. So
that was actually being accounted for. So we assumed 4 hours of video conferencing to compensate for the loss of commuting. So that is something you have to assume. But yeah.
Wow, nice. Yeah, we're also going to actually share that case study in detail in the next couple of days. So you can also read more about that soon.
Yeah. So next slide. So yeah, so now of course a little bit of a link to the SBTI. So now you have reduction strategies. You know what the potential is of these individual strategies. So now it also helps you to set realistic targets, of course. And this is just a different view of what we have shown before. So you see the graphs of the university on the left-hand side and applied science on the right-hand side, different profiles. And the colors indicate what the effect would be of these individual measures and what the remaining emissions would be. So if the university were to execute all the things that were in the strategies, they could actually reduce their emissions to around 50% of what they are right now. For the University of Applied Sciences, it's a little bit of a different case. It has a different emission profile, so also the effectiveness of each measure is different than for the university. So there you see that by executing the same measures, the remaining emissions would actually be a little bit higher than for the right-hand side, around I think 65% or 70% remaining. Okay, next slide, please. And then, of course, you still want to reevaluate what you have done and also see where you can optimize further. So some of the categories that weren't discussed, but where some potential actually lays is, and this has also been our advice to the university, look in these areas if you want to focus on areas where procurement really has a big effect. So some of the areas that we identified were cleaning services and software purchasing. So all the data centers that have to run in order to make all the programs work. The real estate that varies from construction to maintenance, and also chemical purchasing. So yeah, maybe a little bit unexpected, they purchase quite a lot of chemicals to run for the science departments, but also for other purposes. And that also has quite a large footprint, but that was not in detailed scope in this case. All right. Thanks. Yeah, so this is just a summary of the presentation so far. So again, the steps, hopefully that was clear from the presentation. So first we established the baseline. We plotted the reduction scenarios in order to see what targets are realistic. And then it is also time to monitor or execute, but also monitor and see where you can improve. Thanks. That was last slide.
Thank you for your presentation, Peter. And yeah, we have more questions for you later. But now the next, so there was a service-based business. It's very different from having a traditional, product-based business model. But now let's move to something a bit more tangible. So something you actually see all the time. I can look downstairs from here, I see the street, and Asphalt is a product that every one of us is in touch with basically every day, no matter if you cycle, walk, or take the car. And Lisa Overmars is a very experienced in measuring the impact of asphalt businesses. And in this case study, she's going to walk us a bit through, how do you apply that same process to an asphalt business? So Lisa, I'm very curious about your case.
Yes, thank you, Toby. So my name is Lisa Overmars, and I work as an environmental specialist at Ecochain now for a bit more than 2 years. So indeed, I have quite some experience with asphalt calculations, but also in the food and agri sector. Indeed, I'm going to tell you a bit more about asphalt now. Next slide. So indeed, as Toby told you, all know asphalt as the material on our roads. And asphalt is actually produced by mixing stones and bitumen and sand and other filling agents, and actually also old asphalt. And that are the main materials, and it's mixed by heating it at high temperature and then mixing it between 130 and 180 degrees. And then it's actually stored hot and transported to the application area. And there it's applied and also still hot. And then, of course, it's used for about 10 to 20 years. Then it's removed and then it's recycled again to produce new asphalt. Next slide. And in the Netherlands, actually, in tendering processes, sustainability is becoming more and more important. So that's also the case for asphalt. And in this case, for asphalt, but also for other construction materials, sustainability is one of the selection criteria, just like the price and the quality. And for that, the environmental cost indicator is used. And the environmental cost indicator is a framework for measuring the environmental impact in the Dutch construction sector. So it's just a measure for indeed the sustainability, and it of course also includes the GHG emissions. So it says basically one score for products. And Ecochain helps companies calculate the product footprints to get an environmental cost indicator so that they can participate in tenders. And actually, now we'll go into the step plan. So the first step is to establish the baseline. And it's actually a bit different than for Peter's example, because actually here we start with making the product LCAs. So calculating the product footprints and the carbon footprints. And we do that by calculating the product footprint from cradle to grave. And what does that mean, cradle to grave? Cradle to grave means that you include the entire life cycle into your assessment. So you include the materials that you use, you include the production process, you include the application, you include the use, and also the waste treatment at the end, and the recycling. And actually what I plotted in this figure is you see different asphalt mixtures. So you have different types of asphalt, for example, used as a top layer, or used, for example, you have different mixtures used in or highways than compared to other local ways. So that's the difference. And then you have a certain score. So you see that the materials in green, that part contributes most to the environmental impact. And then in light blue, you see actually some savings and negative impact due to the recycling. And actually, from this product footprints, we can calculate the company footprint, because the company footprint is actually the sum of all the product footprints together. And that's actually what you can do in Ecochain. So you calculate the product footprints, and then you get the company footprint. And that's what you see in this graph. So what you see here is on company level, you see the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And you see, first of all, the scope 1 direct emissions. Then you see the scope 2 indirect emissions. And then you see the scope 3 emissions. And that is actually divided into different categories, as Roel also mentioned. So you have the purchased goods and services, that's category 1. And you also have, for example, the scope 12, that is the end-of-life treatment of sold products. So what you see is that scope 1 is the most important, together with the scope 3, the purchased goods and services. Yeah, so now we can even zoom in a bit more and go into the hotspots. So what you see here, we actually again have the same scope 1, 2, and 3. You see, as we saw before, you saw that the scope 1 was one of the most dominant ones, and that's actually mainly caused by the impact of the natural gas. So that's in green. And then we also saw that scope 3, the category 1, so that's the purchased goods, is quite important, and that's in yellow. And for the yellow part, you see that mainly the bitumen is causing the impact. And bitumen is actually quite important in asphalt. You need it as a binder, basically, but it's byproduct from refining of crude oil. We also call that petroleum. And for the rest, you can also see some other categories in there. But those, so for example, the scope 3 category 4 and the scope 3 category 9. But those I mentioned are the most important ones. And those were the ones we used for determining the improvement options. So we can go to the next slide. So the step 2 is indeed to determine the improvement options and measure this. And we actually identified 2 improvements. And the first is actually for the scope 1 direct emissions. We saw that the natural gas was the most important. And what you can actually do is you can switch to biogas. And that's reflected on the left. And you see that you can have quite a reduction by switching from natural gas to biogas. So that's envisioned in the left. And then the second thing we identified was actually to use more recycled material in asphalt. So that you can see for number 2. So the circles connected to that. And what we mean with recycled materials, we actually mean using more old asphalt to produce new asphalt. And by that, you have to use less primary materials. So you have to use less bitumen, less stones. So that in that way, you can reduce your impact. And in this way, we identified 26% of reduction potential. And based on this, actually, it was decided by the company to go for the target of 5 years to have a reduction of 26%. And every year they will calculate and monitor their impact to see how they're progressing. So next slide. So to summarize again, the steps. So first we established the baseline, and then we saw that the purchased goods, so the bitumen and the natural gas, are the most important hotspots. And then we saw that that we could reduce the impact by using more recycled material and by using biogas. So that were the reduction scenarios identified. And then we identified that by that you could go for a 26% reduction. And they set the target to reach that in 2025. And every year they will monitor if they're going towards that goal. And actually, due to the fact that in the tendering process, they are also forced sort of to go for these improvements also, they are quite confident that they will make this target.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for your presentation. Really, really interesting. I also learned something new, yeah, that closes our presentations for today. But we have a lot of questions that came in through the chat through before, and yeah, we're not going to get through all the questions, but I encourage you, if your question will not be answered today, please refer to our website. You can always send us a message. You can send a contact request. You can get a demo request. Whatever works for a specific case, because of course all the graphics that Lisa just shared were also from within our application. So happy to answer any questions. You can also reach out to our consultants right away with the emails in this presentation. But let's get to the questions. So there's a question here about verification. So I'm not sure, maybe Roel, that's for you. Do I always need a third-party verifier? How does verification play in the process with science-based targets?
Yeah. So a couple of things. The work that Lisa showed for the tendering procedures, in that case, for the product footprints, a mandatory verification is needed, or is often requested by the tendering organization. So in that case, it is a requirement. Then there is a voluntary assurance. So many companies nowadays have their annual greenhouse gas emission disclosures audited, exactly in the same way as they have their financial disclosures audited. And there's also a trend going on there, Toby, because in a couple of years ago, the financial disclosures were audited at reasonable assurance, so the highest assurance level given by the external accountant. But we see, limited assurance, and now we see more and more companies asking for reasonable assurance. And definitely more and more companies start to audit their results. Now, the third review process is the question is regarding science-based targets. What SBTi does, if you submit your target, is that they will verify if the target was defined in line with their requirements. So there are a couple of review mechanisms in place. And it's also important to have these assurance mechanisms in place because the information needs to be robust. We need to be credible, and organizations need to be held accountable. So it is crucial that we have this in place.
Very nice, thank you, Roel. Then another company question that also popped up is that I work in a consultancy, so service-based businesses with, we're consulting oil companies. So do you have to actually consider the impact of our clients for our reporting, or when we want to report on GHG emissions, do we exclude the impact of our consulting clients?
Is that a question for me, Toby?
Maybe, yeah, maybe you pick it up.
So before I joined Ecochain, I used to work for a consultant and worked there for 12 years. So I do have an opinion about it. If you make a positive impact with your client, you can actually, report on your impact with your client as a positive contribution. Of course, you could do that. But we found it, when I worked at Ernst & Young, we found that really hard because the data gathering was just an impossible task. And actually the emissions that we could influence best were emissions related to our offices, as well as the mobility. So we really decided to focus on those two emission types.
Nice, thank you. So there's another question here. Which kind of tool do you use, or which software instruments do you use to measure GHG emissions? So I think all of you know that answer, but yeah, maybe we'll just pick it up because yeah, I think I will ask specifically during your talk.
Oh yeah, we have Ecochain software, which I think is a very nice software because ours, and I don't want to commercialize that in this call, but what the software does, it enables you to deliver product footprints, but also the company footprint. And what it does, it reconciles the two into a single world, allowing organizations to only do the data gathering once, as well as getting a really robust result because it automatically reconciles by design. So we use our own software to do it for companies.
Very nice. Can you clarify the difference between carbon neutral and carbon positive or negative? I think it also plays in a bit with your presentation, Roel. I have a couple of questions for Lisa and Peter after this too, so no worries about it.
Yeah, so of course you. So many companies, of course, struggle to become really carbon neutral because yeah, in the end, if you want to really become carbon negative, you need to have a carbon sink somewhere in your system. So you need to absorb carbon and do removal from the atmosphere in order to compensate the rest for your business. That is a big challenge, but that's the fifth step in our process, is to do some sort of offsetting. Now, if you, for instance, convert land so that the soil does carbon sequestration, or planting trees, like I said before, I think it makes sense to report on it, but many companies will use an external mechanism like offsetting in order to achieve that. So carbon negative means you're a carbon sink. Carbon neutral means zero. Carbon positive, which is valid for most organizations, is that you have a residual emission.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, in your story, or in your case, obviously the company works with many suppliers, and one question that popped up was, how do you handle methodological inconsistencies, for example, in the primary data from suppliers? So you get data in different formats, or your suppliers supply data in different ways. So how do you kind of turn that all into one reliable analysis?
Yeah, good question. I think what we on the one side have is we have quite strict rules on how to perform like an assessment. So that helps on getting and asking the correct data from the suppliers. And on the other hand, we also, for example, I also saw that there was a question like, okay, what is causing the impacts of the materials from the suppliers? We mainly use in the background database for that, for example, Ecochain. And in there, the impact of, for example, 1 kilogram of sand is described, or 1 kilogram of bitumen. So that those two things I think help a lot to get high data quality.
Nice. Okay. Then Peter, there's one more question that I think applies to your case. Employee travel in offices, is that scope 3 or scope 2?
Yeah, that's always a challenging one. It depends on who owns the asset. So if you as a company own, for example, lease cars, then it would actually be in your scope 1 and not in your scope 3 emissions. But this is just a boundary question of where do you place emissions. But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol online provides a really good list with instructions on which emission factors fit in which category. So if you struggle with this, I would suggest to have a look at those documents.
Very nice. Well, time is up. Again, if you have more questions, please feel free to reach out on our website or directly to the email addresses supplied in the presentation. Again, we will send you a follow-up with the recording as well as the presentation. I saw this question popping up too, so we'll send you the slides as well as the recording and a little summary. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for your great question and great participation. Thank you to our speakers, to Roel, Lisa, and Peter. Also thank you to Zazala, who was also supporting us during the entire conversation by curating questions and helping with the technical setup. Thank you everyone for joining again, and stay safe, stay healthy, and have a good rest of the day. And I'm looking forward to seeing what all of you are going to do with the input, and hopefully we'll see many more companies embracing science-based targets. And I'm looking forward to extending this conversation in the next couple of weeks, and looking forward to seeing your progress. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and have a beautiful week.